Have you ever been trying to get through a small space and you got stuck before? Yeah, I think of Santa. I think of Santa going down the chimney, or the Grinch, or someone like that, and there's a small space to get through. I know, like when Lauren had our babies, that was tough. Um, those babies, they didn't. There was no other way. Well, there was another way if you cut them open or cut her open to remove them. But usually there's not a lot of space sometimes when you're trying to go through a wall. Uh, and I think that's part of God's plan. That's part of God's plan for growth is you're going to come to a wall or some crawl space, some chimney, and you're like, I'm a little too thick. Like I got, THICC, maybe an extra C or C after that, and you're like, I'm not going to fit through. I just spit, and I just rhymed also. But I can't fit through this this crawl space. And what do I do? Is this God's will? Because sometimes when you have a wall or a crawl space or something approaching you, you don't feel like it's from God because this looks very impossible. But actually, these sorts of walls are precisely what God has for us. These are exactly God's plan and purpose, and they don't look very welcoming or inviting or very pleasant. I remember Luke was kind of stuck in the birth canal, and he came out with kind of a more triangular head. And sometimes we feel like we got misshapen on the other side, but it works out because now he doesn't have a triangle head, and it's okay. So the point being, Marvin and I, we're gamers, and I know some of you like to game. I know Nick does, and some of you like to game, but you can't really get experience points or level up and get more loot if you don't beat a boss. So there's some RPGs and games like that where you have to beat a particular boss, you level up, you get the loot, but you don't get all those perks and wonderful things if you don't beat the boss, right? So in the same way, God wants to bless us and help us grow into godly character, and he wants to I don't know, whatever God wants to do on the other side of that wall, but you're going to have to go through a testing, and the testing is arduous and difficult, and sometimes the odds look pretty insurmountable. And there's a guy named St. John of the Cross, and he wrote this document, this book called Dark Night of the Soul, and it's referenced in this book we've been using as a backdrop, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. But the idea of the Dark Night of the Soul is that there's a trial that you experience, but it's a specific kind of trial. It's a trial in which you don't feel God anymore. You don't feel the blessings of God. You don't feel the presence of God. You don't feel very joyful. Whatever it is, it's like the feelings of God are absent. And your natural inclination is to think, God is not here because I don't feel him. I remember there's a student who was experiencing this phenomenon called the Dark Night of the Soul, and we were trying to figure out what was wrong with her. I didn't really know how to help her. And I realized over time, and especially thinking about the Dark Night of the Soul, it's like this is a trial that God had for her, and that's just what it was. And it's interesting too, the Dark Night of the Soul phenomenon, for whatever reason, usually happens in countries where Christians are, where there's little persecution. So it's interesting because if you think about church history and the growth of missions and things like that, a lot of Christians in other countries, like let's say China, or where there's persecution, there are actually almost no accounts of a Dark Night of the Soul, and because their trial is persecution, and so they're just like constantly like being sanctified and emboldened because of their circumstances. But for us in, let's say, Western Christianity, this is almost like 100% common for Western Christians because we don't get persecuted like that. So it's not like God's like, well, I'm going to make the people in persecuted countries more like Jesus than the people in Western countries where the persecution is bad. When God gets a hold of us, his intention is to make us like Jesus, no matter who we are. So it doesn't matter if you live in a persecuted country or a less persecuted country. God's going to form you into the image of Jesus regardless of the level of trial and persecution you experience. So one of the ways he does that is this specific trial called the Dark Night of the Soul, which is, again, when the good feelings of God's presence evaporate. So it's a common Christian experience we do have. And Psalm 88 and 89 could very well be great expressions of that sense of despair. But we're going to take a look at Exodus 13, and we're going to look at this dark night of the soul that God brings his people into. So Exodus chapter 13. All right. Exodus 13, verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham at the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. So a little context of this, God basically nuked Egypt with all kinds of horrendous plagues. And Pharaoh's had enough of it and just said, just leave, just get out of here. So Moses skedaddles with all the Israelites and he takes them out away from Egypt. And it says that as Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them through the Philistine country. And bless you. And so for the Israelites, they would probably want to get to their destination through the shortest route possible. And the shortest route possible was through Philistine territory. But God, in his infinite wisdom, recognizes that, well, if my people go through the Philistine country, they're going to have to fight a war. Bless you. And therefore, they're not going to want to really fight this war. And they're going to want to go back to Egypt. And so God, in his wisdom, says, I'm not going to let them do that. Actually, we're going to go the long route, and we're going to stay away from the Philistine territory, which there are arguably Egyptian garrisons as well. So we're going to go the long route, and we're going to make sure we leave Egypt, like leave Egypt. Side note, if you're experiencing some kind of detour in your life, it's usually God's wisdom and protection for your season of detouring. Detouring is God's sovereign blessing over your life, protecting you from going backwards and helping you go forwards. That's how God's detours work. So the Israelites, they end up going, and what's really cool is they bring the bones of Joseph. So we talked about Joseph last week, and by this time he's pretty dead, and so he's just kind of a bag of bones. But he made the Israelites swear an oath that they would take his bones to the Promised Land. And that was, his bones were a physical reminder of God's deliverance of Israel back when there was a famine, and he fed the Israelites. And also it's a reminder of God's promise back with Abraham, saying, hey, your descendants are going to live in this Promised Land area. So his bones, I mean, you're like, that's kind of gross, like some dude's bones, but they were reminders that one day Joseph would be buried in the Promised Land and God would fulfill that. And after that, what's really wild is that it says the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud. So there's actually a physical manifestation of the glory of God. And it's constant. It says either by day or by night, there's either a pillar. So you can picture this enormous like column, if you will, and it's just this cloud. Like, it'd be pretty awesome if we had this enormous cloud just like floating in the middle of the room. We're like, hey, God. And the pillar's like just there, just this floating cloud just chilling, right? And then at night, it's this blazing column of fire. That must have been very wild to see. Just like there's like when it first appeared, like what is this going on here? And God is visibly, physically showing the presence of himself with his people. And the reality is, just like that pillar was constantly present with his people and his people could see it, that doesn't change the fact of God's omnipresence. What I mean by that is God is just as present in this room as he was when he was a pillar of whatever, either by day or by night with his people. So that's really encouraging that he was showing, displaying to them that he is with them. And they're going to need that reassurance because they're going to not feel like God is with them. Even though they can see this pillar, they can see this pillar of cloud, they can see this pillar of fire, they're going to feel in a moment like he's not there, even though he's clearly there. And you're going to feel like that too in your trials. You're going to feel like God isn't there, even though he is there. So take a look at chapter 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-Hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal-zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." So the Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers all over them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they encamped by the sea near Pi-Hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." Bye-bye. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." So God anticipates that Pharaoh's going to change his mind. You know what? They're going to be in this place. Let's just get them back because we kind of lost all of our workforce. And, actually, if you calculate the math, that's going to be pretty bad for us economically speaking. So let's get our free labor force back. Let's recapture them. And they will willingly come back because all we need to do is just threaten to kill them because I'm bringing my entire army out. So Pharaoh went all in. And he brought his entire army out, brought the best chariots and every weapon at his disposal. Interestingly, it says, and this is also throughout this Exodus stories, there's a back and forth, or rather, even a harmony between Pharaoh hardening his own heart and the Lord hardening his heart. So there's this kind of marriage, if you will, of the wills. God has his will and Pharaoh has his will, but somehow they are in unity in a sense. Now, obviously, Pharaoh's against the Lord, but in terms of how God is going to get glory, he's going to get credit. God's going to look really good because of what's going to happen with the Egyptians. So can you just imagine this kind of for a second? You are a slave and you just got freed and you are heading out to the wilderness where you don't have any allies and you have the greatest army in the entire ancient world pursuing you, and there's only a body of water in front of you. Can you imagine how you would feel in that moment? And that's how they felt. And it said they are terrified, they're crying out, and they're like, are you serious, Moses? Like, we're just going to die? Like, there wasn't enough real estate in Egypt to bury us, so we have to just die out here? Is that what you want? And what's beautiful about Moses' response is he's just very direct and says, "Do not be afraid." And you might be thinking, how is that possible? Because I would be kind of afraid of that, right? But I think the reason Moses is so direct and abrupt with that "do not be afraid" is because they've already seen all the crazy stuff that's happened. They have plenty of evidence to know that God is going to be fighting for them, because it's already impossible to be delivered from Egypt. So when God gives us enough evidence in the past to reflect on, that is God's reassurance that he's going to get you through the wall. And it's very important during those seasons where you feel like you're not going to make it to reflect on the times where he did make it work. So Moses is reassuring the people. And this is actually the password for my Wi-Fi, Exodus 14:14. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Because God doesn't have an enemy that ever has successfully opposed him. God's either defeated every enemy he's had or will defeat every enemy he's ever had. So if you have that being on your side, then what's the point of fighting? Like, just let God fight your battle. Just chill, just relax. And what's really wild about this whole interaction too is the Israelites will never have to fight. They're just going to go on a long walk. Like, just ignore the Egyptians in the story for a second. Just pretend they don't exist. And just focus on Israel. And basically what's going to happen is they're just going to go on a long hike. They're going to come to this body of water, and now they're just kind of chilling. And so that's where they find themselves. All right. Let's go to verse 15, and we'll finish the chapter. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh and his chariots and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. All that night, the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. We'll pause there. Sometimes we forget how amazing this is. And some people try to brush it off like, well, they were part of the part of the Red Sea where it was only like 3 feet deep and it was like not a big deal, right? It's like, no, like they went in the very deepest part probably, or one of the deeper parts of the Red Sea. I swam in the Red Sea before and it's pretty deep. Yeah, it's like really, it's pretty sizable. I was actually kind of scared. I think I saw like a barracuda or something swimming, like some 30 feet away, and I was like, oh, I'm going to die out here. But anyway, I didn't. And yeah, the Red Sea is pretty deep. So it's, yeah, they wouldn't be terrified, right? It has to make sense. So they're at the Red Sea. It's a deep water. And even before that, which is really cool, it says the angel of God had been traveling. He goes back. There's a pillar in the front also that as they were traveling, and he goes back. And so you see God is now positioning himself in between his people and Egypt. And for whatever reason, we don't actually precisely know the mechanics of this whole darkness to one side, light to the other. The long story short is that both sides were prevented from engaging with each other. We don't know necessarily. I mean, there's some different renderings perhaps on how that worked. But long story short is God is fighting for his people. And when it says angel of God, we don't know if that is specifically the angel of the Lord, who arguably could be the pre-incarnate Christ. I tend to lean that way. But I love how God is actively fighting for his people, and his people don't even have to do anything. So what's really cool, I mean, I was watching a video of this, and I apologize if it's inaccurate or even fake, but from what I saw in this video, it seemed pretty legit. But they found a lot of military chariot kind of material at the bottom of the Red Sea, and also on the shore of the Red Sea is like cemented sand that really only comes from probably 3,000 degree temperature. So like molten sand, and you would expect that with the pillar of fire. And Maybe we could all collectively do some research and we'll find out if that's 100% true. I didn't see it when I was there, but I was also arguably not in the same area where maybe this precise thing happened. So God's protecting his people, and Moses just stretches out his hand, and then like the water comes up. I don't know what's more impressive, the fact that the water stood up on both sides or the fact that the ground was dry. Because you need both. You can't have the water come up and then everything's all muddy and everyone starts to get stuck and, all your animals are going to get stuck. But God does two miracles. He makes the water go up and then it's on dry ground. It's just like they're just like walking on a path. And I think we take this story for granted because you're like, oh, you just kind of read it and that seems cool. But then picture yourself like when we live near the Pacific Ocean. Just picture yourself in front of the Pacific Ocean. You can imagine thousands of people trying to kill you behind, and then all of a sudden, the Pacific Ocean just like opens up, right? And you can just start walking out there. Like this crazy sandbar just like emerges, right? God is totally for his people and makes a way. And his people are at a literal wall. They're at a literal wall of water that is impassable. And they're not going to be able to swim it, but yet God has made a way, and God always makes a way through walls, especially when it's for our growth and his glory, because God's going to get glory from this. So let's read verse 23 and we'll finish it. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and clouded the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in Moses, his servant. So it gets to the point actually where it's getting intense because the Egyptians are actually catching up and they're getting pretty close. And then it says that God jammed their wheels. Another translation is remove their wheels. So either their wheels just stopped working or their wheels disappeared. So we don't know which is which, but somehow the chariots aren't even working anymore. And they're thrown into confusion, having difficulty driving. And you start to have the soldiers saying, "Let's get away. This is not working. They have God fighting for them, and we're gonna be in deep trouble." So all God does is have Moses move his hand, and the water flows back and kills them all. And numerically, by comparison, you have the entire greatest army on planet Earth all died, and not one Israelite died. It's a big distinction between odds war stats. Like, what if you were in a war and you said, "Yeah, we didn't lose one person, and we killed all those people"? You're like, "Oh, good job. Yeah, good job." And God's flexing here. God's getting glory, and like, yeah, not one of our people died, and all of them died. And they were much better equipped. So obviously at the end, it says that the Lord displayed his mighty hand, and the people feared God. Yeah, I hope you did. Yeah, they feared him. They revered and trusted in him. They respected God, and they followed Moses, and they go on their merry way. Now that's obviously quite a trial, but you can imagine what that would do to someone's faith. And for every wall or dark night of the soul season in which the trial is really hard and it's hard to see God or feel God, even though you know God is there, God is deepening your trust. That's the reason why. Because if God's presence and the good feelings of him were there, then we would rely on that, and we would actually misunderstand that as being God. But the feelings of God are not the same as God himself. Does that make sense? The feelings of God, the feeling of being at peace, the feeling of the love of God, the feeling of joy, those are after effects of the actual presence of God. And God's intention for us is to not rely on the feelings we have about God to experience God. God wants us to trust him despite the feelings. And when we experience deep trials without feeling like God's there, it helps us trust God more deeply because we're not dependent upon the feelings we have. Same thing in a dating relationship or marriage. The same sort of concept, because you're not always going to have those feelings of your heart fluttering or the first time you saw her or whatever it is. You can't be constantly dependent upon those fluttering, exceptionally high feelings of love to continue your relationship with your spouse. Same way with God. If we just relied on the highs and the feelings and the joys of being with God, then we're not actually really deepening the relationship with God. We still kind of have this crutch of the feelings of God that we're basing our faith on. So God is always going to deepen our faith in him. And there was a season in which I was really struggling with this. I feel like I hit a wall because I was really having some pretty strong spiritual attack. I mentioned it before. There's a time in high school I felt like I was hearing voices and very condemning and accusatory things in my head, and I would wake up and it'd be like throughout the day, it'd be so exhausting, and it was going on for like a year or something like that. It was just so frustrating. And the idea was that kept coming into my head was this idea of like, well, you've sinned and like God can't forgive you. And it was just like, what is going on? And why can't this thing stop? And what was really crazy is I went on this debate trip to DC. I was one of those debating nerds on this debate team, and I didn't even really like it. I just wanted to put on my resume. But anyway, so I'm out. I go on this plane trip, and this guy suggested to me, hey, can I switch with you? I was like, okay, sure. So I go sit. I sit in this new place, and there's this guy reading his Bible. He's got his Bible open. And I just started talking to him, and I'm telling him what I'm going through. And yeah, he just really gave me all the words I felt like I needed to hear. I felt like I was super encouraged. I felt super blessed. And I almost was wondering if he was like a real human being. I thought almost like it was an angel, because it was everything I needed to hear in that moment, right? And God will get you through that, but we have to fix our hearts and minds on the truth that he is actually there. May not feel like he's there, may feel like things are pressing in and you're not going to make it, and your skin's getting all scraped up, and you're suffering, right? And you feel like you're going to get stuck, and you're like, I'm going to get back in this hole. Or like our children, they're like, it's kind of uncomfortable. I'm going to get back in this womb. Like I'm going to retreat. I'm going to go back to Egypt. But God's like, no, we're going to push you through. We're going to get you through this. And he does. There's this psalm. You can write it down and you can read it later. But it's Psalm 136 is pretty famous because it has this refrain over and over again saying his love endures forever. It's like it says a line, his love endures forever. It says a line, his love endures forever. And it says in verse 10, to him who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, his love endures forever, and brought Israel out from among them, his love endures forever. With a mighty hand and outstretched arm, his love endures forever. What will help you getting through the trial is knowing that God actually still loves you, that his love endures forever with an outstretched arm. And the Bible says that God has demonstrated his love in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So with Christ's outstretched arms for us on a cross, he has parted the Red Sea. Because when he died, it split the temple curtain. That was the wall between us and God. We have no access to God. So when Jesus dies, the temple veil was torn, and now there's a way through. In the same way that the Israelites needed a passage through the Red Sea as they were being harassed and consumed and going to be utterly destroyed. In the same way, we needed a pathway to God through Christ and his death and resurrection for us to overcome our ultimate enemy, sin and death, which Jesus has conquered on the cross in his resurrection. The temple was torn in two. And this is what it says in Hebrews, that we have this hope as an anchor for our soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where our forerunner, Jesus, has entered on our behalf. He has become our priest forever. No matter what circumstances you go through in life and the trials of it, we have a forerunner in Christ. And that's always going to be a reassurance, because you're never really going to see, I mean, maybe. I haven't heard of stories, or maybe I have, but I can't verify 100%. But you may not necessarily physically see anything that indicates that God is actually there. But this verse is saying that you have a forerunner. You have this person, this person who has been like a pillar of cloud or fire, like an angel of God who has stood in front of you and is in between you and the enemy. A.W. Tozer writes this quote: "It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply," which is counterintuitive at times, because you think, well, I don't know if I want to be hurt, because that sounds unpleasant, and does that really result in blessing? And it does. And the blessing is the deepening of our faith and a richer, more beautiful relationship with God. And like with my wife and the trials that we've gone through as a married couple, there are circumstances and seasons in which things aren't that pleasant, right? In which it seems like so many things are not going our way, around us, but then God makes a way. God makes a way. And now, Lauren mentioned it the other day, but she's like, I think our marriage can handle anything now because of what we've gone through. I was like, yeah, you're totally right. I think we have. We have. And the reassurance that we have is going to be Romans 8:28, that, and we know in all things that God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So if we can trust God that, God, I'm going through something very difficult. The circumstances are tough. I don't feel like I'm going to make it. But God is going to reassure us that everything's going to work out for good. It's going to work out for his glory. It's going to work out for our good. Whenever things are for God's glory, it's always for our benefit. And so even though it's unpleasant, God's going to birth something in you, which is the deepening of your faith. There's going to be a greater level of brokenness, as Pete Scazzero says. There's a deeper cleansing that happens. There's a greater appreciation for mystery, the unknowing. It's okay to not know, and you're going to be even more okay with that. And that's a blessing. There's going to be a deeper ability to wait. I don't know if you remember being a kid and you like waiting for 5 minutes for something felt like an eternity, right? And now as an adult, you're like, 5 minutes? No big deal. I can wait an hour, right? But as a growing Christian, the waiting, the patiently waiting on God becomes easier because we trust him more deeply. Also, there's a greater detachment to Pete Scazzero writes, the wall more than anything cuts off our attachments to who we think we ought to be or who we falsely think we are. Layers of our counterfeit self are shed. Something truer that is Christ in and through us slowly emerges. So kind of like a snake, sometimes they remove their old skin and they'll go against a rock and they'll scrape it off or whatever. In the same way that Jesus is scraping off the old person. He is scraping off the old person, and it's unpleasant, but it reveals a much better skin underneath that is new. And just to conclude, and we'll close outside, is there's a story called, or not a story, but someone wrote their story down. It's in a book called The Grace Disguised by Jerry Sittster. And it was very tragic, in which he lost his mom, his wife, and his daughter all in a car crash. They were in one car, and all of them died in a car crash. And horribly tragic. And that was his dark night of the soul, where he felt like God wasn't there. Understandably so. He says this, though, but in coming to the end of ourselves, we can also come to the beginning of a vital relationship with God. Our failures can lead us to grace and to a profound spiritual awakening. So, when a dark night of the soul or a particular trial in which you don't feel the presence of God, God's intention is for you to run out of your own resources. He wants you to say, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to give up, and I'm going to just slither back and go back to my old ways. And God's intention is for you to come to the end of yourself, not because he wants to crush you, to demoralize you, but God's intention for you to come to the end of yourself is to come to the start of him. And when we do that, that's when our faith exponentially deepens. And we will say that the Lord is good, even when the circumstances are not.